Okay, so thank you very much for the introduction, Tim, and thank you very much for inviting me here today. I'm going to be talking about UKIP and particularly their collapse, and that's something that really goes against the trend in Western Europe recently, where most populist radical right parties have increased their vote share significantly, but in the last few years, or in the last few months even, UKIP have collapsed, and I think this provides a lot of important lessons for why radical right parties do well in Europe to start with. So the presentation is called How the Collapse of UKIP Explains Variation in Radical Right Support Across Europe. And just to really give a very sort of brief overview of British politics in terms of polling in the last 10 years, it says 2010, this should actually be 2012. But starting in 2010, the Liberal Democrats and the Conservatives went into government. So by 2012, this point here, we can see that the Lib Dems had collapsed. And Labour were doing far better in the polls than the Lib Dems, and then the Conservatives at this time. It looked like the Labour would win the next election. During this time, also, we see the steady rise of UKIP. And they keep going from, this is when they started to be polled. So they're around less than 10% here, just at probably 6 or 7%. Then up until the 2014 European Parliament elections, they do better and better. And just prior to that point, as UKIP are doing well, as Labour are doing far better than the Conservatives, David Cameron decides to promise a referendum on EU membership if the Conservatives win the next election. So then we move on to, then the Conservatives actually start to do far better. We can see UKIP still doing well, UKIP collapsing, Labour collapsing until the 2015 election. And that's another major turning point. Labour lose, the Conservatives get a surprise majority victory, which means two things happen. One, Ed Miliband, the former leader of the Labour Party, resigns, and he's replaced by the far-left Jeremy Corbyn. And it means that the Conservatives, with their surprise majority, which they never thought they would get, are in a position where they must fulfill their manifesto pledge to hold an EU referendum. And we see that what happens is the Conservatives start to do pretty well. And that really is until, where is it? Around this point here. And that's the EU referendum. We can see that in mid-2016, the UK has the EU referendum, Leave wins, and there's a very quick leadership contest after Cameron resigns, and May comes in, she promises Brexit, and the Conservatives start to do really well. And UKIP collapse, or begin to collapse. We can see they go down a bit at this point, and Labour are doing really badly. So for a good 6 months, the Conservatives are in complete dominance up here. Maybe I can just use this, actually. So the Conservatives are completely dominating here. Corbyn and Labour are doing terribly, and everyone expects that the Conservatives would win an election if there were to be one, but no one expects that. All of a sudden, May calls an election and has a terrible electoral campaign, and the left quickly unite around Jeremy Corbyn. The Conservatives lose their majority in the election, and then we're faced with this situation here. This is the election here. Since then, there's real stability. During this time, UKIP have completely collapsed, and at the moment, it looks like they may cease to exist as a party in the UK. They have all sorts of problems internally, and they're polling pretty badly, 5% or so. So looking at these polling changes and this evolution, particularly in the radical right here in terms of UKIP, coming from not doing too well to a bit better, and then eventually collapsing, fits in with a project I'm doing at the moment, which is about explaining aggregate-level party support. And the project looks at the relationship between issue salience at the aggregate level, at the national level, and party support across Europe. And the basic idea is that different parties benefit from different issues of the day. So it's fairly intuitively, so roughly, as I say, this is just the start of a project, really. The center-right do well when the economy and defense are salient. The center-left do well when social issues are salient, health, housing, education. The populist right do well when immigration is salient. And the Greens do well when the environment is salient. I haven't thought about what would be good for the Liberals yet. So how does this fit in with UKIP? How does this fit in with the radical right? Well, the radical right have done, as has already been discussed, have done increasingly well in recent years. These are 10 European countries, 10 Western European countries. And we can see that in 8 of the 10, we can see an overall increase in vote share in terms of polling. And the only exceptions are, let's see if I can find them, Finland, where the True Finns, or now called the Finns, collapsed. And the other exception is Belgium, where the Flemish Interest Party collapsed, although then they came back. Besides the big increases elsewhere, really pretty clear increased success, probably the most important trend is what happened in 2015. So you can see, unfortunately, I don't have the x-axes labeled here, but you can see there's a peak around the same point for almost all the parties. And in some cases, that's a local peak, and in other cases, in most cases, that's an absolute peak. And then most of them fall off, actually. So radical right performances start to do a bit worse. The only exception, as we all found out a few days ago, is Italy, where the Lega Nord actually continues to do quite well. So, as I say, there are a number of there are a number of theories around this aggregate level support, why the radical right does well. Already plenty has been done at the individual level. We already have a pretty good idea of who votes for the radical right in most countries. We have a pretty good idea of the causes of that as well in terms of sociodemographics, in terms of attitudes. But the problem with these explanations at the individual level is that the predictors are quite stable. So sociodemographics and attitudes, things like attitudes to immigration, are fairly stable during this time period, yet we see a lot of volatility in populist radical right electoral support. So it doesn't really look like the theories would be, from the individual level, would be so applicable to the aggregate level. But at the macro, at the national, at the aggregate level, there are sort of 4 main explanations in the literature. One is media effects, the other is crime, another is unemployment, and the fourth is immigration rates. Media, crime, and unemployment have been explored quite a lot, and the evidence is at best mixed, but generally there isn't strong evidence to suggest that the media, crime, or unemployment rates affect radical right polling. What has received consistent positive evidence is immigration rates. So it does seem that the higher the immigration rate in a country, the better the radical right does. As I say, there's only really evidence of the fourth here, and it does also fit in very well with the 2 major theories of support for radical right parties, which is, on the one hand, a sort of economic backlash or economic competition, and on the other hand, a cultural backlash or a cultural opposition to a heterogeneous society. So immigration rates fits in with these major theories quite well. However, we argue in this paper, or I argue in this paper, which I'm about to present the findings of, that immigration rates alone are likely to be theoretically incomplete as an explanation for support for the radical right, despite the empirical evidence. And the reason is that a change in behavior, such as a change in voting, would require some kind of cognitive change, a kind of intermediary. People are unlikely to change their voting behavior without changing their thoughts on something. And immigration rates can potentially affect that, but they're not likely to have a direct effect on behavior. And as we know, attitudes to immigration, as I show in the paper, are actually highly stable. So it's unlikely to be attitudes to immigration which are the major cognitive change. So my hypothesis from this, which I also go into in the paper, is there's only one hypothesis in the paper, and that's that immigration rates indeed do lead to greater voting for the radical right. However, they only do so via the positive effect that they have on salience of immigration as a political issue. So it's essentially a 2-stage process. Immigration rates, as well as many other things, such as media effects, such as party cues, increase or decrease the level of salience of immigration, and this is really the final, most proximal cause of vote share of the radical right at the aggregate level. So, To start with, I look at these 10 countries again, and before I go into the correlations, I chose these 10 countries because by 4 criteria. The first is that I exclude post-communist countries for theoretical reasons, which I go into in the paper. I then also only use European Union countries because of the data source I use for this is the Eurobarometer. I would have loved to have used Norway and Switzerland, and I'm fairly confident that we would have seen a similar correlation, but they're not in the Eurobarometer. I then exclude also a number of small countries like Luxembourg, Cyprus, and Malta, and I exclude Greece, unfortunately, because the party system there, because they have 3 what could be called populist radical right, and then really a sort of neo-Nazi party in terms of Golden Dawn, which makes testing this theory quite difficult. However, down to the 10 Western European countries that I do have here, which are all of the large ones, we can see that there's a pretty strong correlation between issue salience, immigration issue salience, which is measured as the percentage of people who say that immigration is one of the top 2 issues affecting their country, and polling support for the radical right. So there's really only 2 exceptions to this, and that is, if I can see it, let's see, Finland, which has a fairly weak correlation there, and then France also below Finland also seems to have quite a weak correlation. But in a lot of the other countries we see it's very strong. And we have the exact correlations here. So as I say, Finland has a negative correlation, so that doesn't bode well. And France, there is a positive correlation, but it's not statistically significant. In the other 8 countries, we see a positive correlation between issue salience and voting for the radical right, and it is statistically significant. So that bodes well. However, this is only correlation, so we should really move on to more robust testing. And the first, most obvious way of doing this, because we want to control for country differences, particularly in terms of the electoral system, particularly in terms of the starting point of the radical right party at the time period in question, from 2005 onwards, when the data becomes available. The best way of doing this is fixed effects panel data models. And so I start off with 4 here, which don't directly test my hypothesis, but do build up to it. So we see in the first one, the effect of salience on polling for anti-immigration or populist radical right parties. We can see in Model 1, salience has a positive effect and it's highly statistically significant. Then immigration rates on polling for radical right parties in Model 2. We can see also that that's statistically significant and positive. And then in Model 3, I test them both together, both salient and the immigration rates directly on voting for the radical right. And we see both have a positive effect, but neither is statistically significant. As I'll go on to show, this is because of multicollinearity. Then finally, I test, as part of my original hypothesis, the effects of immigration rates on salience, not on voting for the radical right. We can see the effect is large and it is statistically significant. However, as I say, this isn't the hypothesis, this is just building up to it. The key hypothesis is a 3-variable relationship where immigration rates affect salience and then salience affects voting for the radical right. So the way to do that is via a multi-group structural equation model. And the basic model is fairly simple. It's extremely simple, actually. So rates affect salience, salience affects polling, and rates also, the direct effect of rates, immigration rates on polling for the radical right, is also tested. And when we do the structural equation model, testing my hypothesis, we can see that this model is indeed confirmed. So rates, let's see, here's polling here. Rates have no statistically significant direct effect on polling. So immigration rates, when controlling for salience, don't directly affect polling. However, immigration rates do have a statistically significant effect on salience, and salience then has a statistically significant effect on polling. So this 3-way model seems to work quite well. However, there are a number of, so on to my conclusions, there is a positive effect of immigration rates on voting for the radical right, yet I consider it theoretically unlikely by itself for a number of reasons, drawing on psychological literature, looking at decision-making and related issues. The correlations between salience and voting for the radical right are very strong. And actually, I showed it's a three-way relationship, from rates to salience to polling. The shortcomings of this paper and my study so far is that I'm only looking at the national level, and this really needs to be tested at the individual level, but the Eurobarometer doesn't actually have party choice in it, so I don't really have a data set. I'll have to look at country-specific data sources. It's also Western Europe only, which I admit is really my own foresight and my own, partially informed by my own ignorance about Eastern Europe. And of course, despite the robust models, there could be confounding variables here. And I'm only using three variables. However, they're highly robust models, fixed effects models, and also a multi-group structural equation model. So the next step is to test at the individual level in a handful of data-rich countries. And just to bring this all the way back to the UK, which is what we were supposed to be interested in to start with, the reason that UKIP collapsed, I believe, is that immigration suddenly became a far less salient issue and was replaced quite obviously with the most salient issue by far, maybe ever, in the UK, which is Brexit. And the UKIP, because of their complete lack of competence, were considered nowhere near likely to be the best party to deal with Brexit. So thank you very much.